Du hører på Nerd Best Friends podcast. Jeg kan seriøst ikke tro at jeg skal bo i USA et helt år, og jeg må bo som så nerdete vertsfamilie.
Welcome back, nerds. You're listening to Nerd Best Friends. My name's Analese, and I'm here with my best friend, Rob.
Hey, it's me, Rob, your best friend, your podcast host, and your problematic independent comic creator. This week, we're talking about... Terrible.
Leave it just like that. That's perfect. I'm leaving it just like that.
This week, we are talking about comic books, specifically non-superhero comic books, which is something that I'm always very excited about. We decided to change that up a little. At the end of last episode, we mentioned doing a movie podcast, but I didn't get excited about it as excited as I am about talking about comic books. So it changed my mind. That's how we do things here. Deal with it.
Not only that, we got so nerdy in our conversation. We were like, let's do a top 5, made a nerd chart about it. And top 5 turned into, well, top 5 and some honorable mentions, top 5 and a few more. Till one point, Rob said, let's do a top 10. And we even have more than a top 10. So we decided we're going to do a part 1 and part 2 for non-superhero comic books. So get ready, buckle down. We have some extra nerd content for you.
Yeah.
Before we get started with that nerd content, Rob, how about the craft beer of the episode?
The craft beer of the episode this week that I'm going to highlight is Stone Brewery out of San Diego. They do a series periodically through the year called Enjoy By, and it is a new beer, kind of an experimental mixture, and they put a new label on it every time. Enjoy By and then a date. So there's Enjoy By 12/25 and then that year, right? So as we're going through Enjoy By 12/25/22, they'll do Enjoy By, I can't remember if they do New Year's Day or New Year's Eve, probably New Year's Day, right? So Enjoy By 1/1/2022. They do some fun ones. They always do 4th of July, Enjoy By 7/4/2022. They do Enjoy By 4/20/2022 every year. Nice. It is always a super hoppy, very high alcohol content, punch you in the tongue IPA. It'll come in a 22 bottle. You just need one to kind of taste it for that year and do your check-in or whatever. Because I know what I'm going to get when I open one, I'm never disappointed by an Enjoy By. It's always a little bit different, and it's always fun to just try a crazy, super strong beer, put it in your fridge and wait to try it on that date for the check-in. That's my craft beer of the week.
So if I'm hearing you right, it's a fun game. They gamify drinking beer. They have delicious beers. It's constantly changing, and they're always IPAs.
Yep.
You're proving my theory right from last episode. Okay, moving on. How about some nerd mail? What you got, Rob?
Nothing specifically to shout out. I'm just very appreciative since the podcast came out, and there's just been a lot more traffic on Twitter and especially Instagram. Because of that, I've made some new internet friends, shared some different content, got some good advice, had some conversations. I got a great recommendation from one person through there that will show its head again at the end of the episode when we talk about the nerdiest thing I did this weekend. I'm very excited about it.
Ooh, that is exciting.
What do you got?
So I did get a question from 2 episodes ago, the 20 for 22 episode. The question was for you. Do you include your son in the shared workspace, or does he have his own? Does he participate in the 20 for 22? Secondary, if that's something he does, how do you navigate that with a teenager and help him with goal setting?
We did include Andrew last year on 21 for 21. It didn't jive with him. He didn't like it. We had a good time thinking of the different goals and the things that he wanted to do, and we made it fun. It was kind of based on my lead. A lot of the stuff had to do with the nerd room and getting projects done and playing different games and things like that. And it just didn't stick. It wasn't something that motivated him. It wasn't something that he enjoyed checking on, which is a lot of the stuff that we talked about in that episode was, what's the right way to do a to-do list, or what's the right way to manage your projects and stuff. And it's well, it's the one that works for you. And the you there is very important, right? Trello has worked really well for me as a motivator and as a fun way to kind of gamify my projects and keep track of them. Did not work for a 13-year-old boy. It was,
I can't imagine it would.
It was like a chore board for him.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it kind of turned into like, well, yeah, I said I wanted to do that back in January or whatever, but I think I just want to play video games with my friends. Leave me alone. So that's where we are on that. But he is, of course, welcome to participate in our family Trello board if that's something as he gets older and his ideas change and he has different things that he wants to do. That for now, nope, didn't work for him, didn't like it, and didn't want to get harshed by his parents. Hey, I noticed you still got 18 things on the Trello board. Do you want to do this? But like, oh no, nothing. That is not the idea. So
you sure you should be playing video games right now? You've got 17 more things and it's November. Yeah,
exactly.
Well, thank you for that, Rob. And thank you for the question. Keep writing into us, keep interacting with us on the social medias. And thanks for writing in. On to the content of this. On our list, Rob, I have comics history. I don't think we have time to go through comics history, but I will say why I like comic books. I was introduced to them, and I'll tell the story a little bit later when I talk about one of my top 10. For someone who's got a very vivid visual imagination, and I have my entire life, without knowing what that was in my youth, picking up a comic book or reading a comic strip in the Sunday comics was always something that let my vivid imagination run wild. And I think much later when we were adults, you explained to me a comic book is a snapshot of the action, right? It's just a one frame moment that's describing the whole thing that's going on. And you have to extrapolate based on the text and the context, what's going on in that scene when you have just that one snapshot. So I think as a kid, they were funny, they were entertaining, but for someone who had an overactive imagination, it was helpful for me to just picture an entire world, which is what happens to me a lot when reading books, but then being given a visual idea for that to then run wild was something I really liked. What about you?
I love that idea of like the comic book frame. It gives you so much, but it gives you that freeze frame of what's happening, right? So different than just a picture or text on a page, you get both. And it makes it very easy for your imagination to fill in everything that happened just before or happened just after and kind of puts that motion maybe in your head. You know, when I read comics, it gives me that opportunity. My mind fills in the blanks. I can hear the voices, I can hear the sounds, and I can, you know, even like imagine, you know, that kind of scenes, and sometimes just sit back and appreciate that art and the detail that's gone into it with certain creators. As far as getting into comics, definitely, you know, when I was a kid, superheroes were cartoons, like animated cartoons, right? You know, I was watching Super Friends and Thundercats and He-Man, like all the superheroes were cartoons. And the first comics I read were just like you, the comics in the newspaper. Right.
Yes.
And just loved that style of sense of humor. Loved Calvin and Hobbes for sure. The way that little scamp would get up to trouble. And that's a good example of how your mind fills things in based on the visual cues. You know, when it's Hobbes in the real world and Hobbes in kind of the imagination world. And you see that surprise that always comes up in the last panel. The Far Side was another one of my favorites when I was a kid, because it's just one weird looking picture. Like, I mean, they're cows, but they don't look like real world cows. And there'll be a sentence underneath, you know, a little caption, and it's hilarious and it'll stick with you. Very, very well done. We read Peanuts, all those kinds of things was just normal reading practice. It wasn't until I got probably older, maybe junior high or so, I remember my first comic books. We went to Costco, and my family didn't have a Costco membership. We like went with another friend, like my friend's mom. Yeah. We went to Costco, and on the shelf they had just this big bundle of Marvel comics. It was this box that you can imagine like a half box, the size of two comics standing side by side. And it was two stacks of comics wrapped in plastic, set in this box, and then the box wrapped in plastic. So you didn't know what you were going to get. And it was whatever price it was. And that's what I got from that weird visit to Costco with my mom's friend. Brought it home and tore it open. And there were all kinds of early 90s comics in there. There was Wolverines and X-Men's and Hulks and Spider-Mans and cool stuff. And maybe 20 comics in there, maybe 16. I'm not sure. But I devoured those comics. I read and reread those comics because that was my comic book collection collection was that small thing of books. And I can still remember some of the covers when I see them, on the internet, stuff like, I'm pretty sure I had that comic in its first run. So those were my first comics. And then I would collect every once in a while when we would go to bookstores or things like that. And I saw a comic that maybe my parents would buy for me or anything like that. And then it wasn't until I got to college and had a part-time job that I really got into like, oh, every Wednesday is when new comic books show up and they put them out on the table. And every Wednesday I go to the comic book shop and I browse the table and I pick up the ones that I want. And then I start a collection organizing and bring my list of like, oh, okay, I have 1, 2, and 3 of this. So is 4 out this week? Oh, there it is. I got to get that to complete the collection and all that stuff. And it amassed and amassed and amassed.
I have not anywhere near similar story to that. In fact, I didn't get into superhero comic books at all. I appreciated Wonder Woman. I appreciated He-Man, She-Ra, all those that we grew up watching animated. I appreciated all those superheroes and, the old Christopher Reeves Superman movies. Everyone loved those. And as we got to be teenagers and Batman came out, the early movies and stuff, I was really into superhero comics that way. But my comic history is more about the non-superhero comic books. And for me, it started at an early age. Growing up in Santa Barbara, we lived on what's considered like the west side of Santa Barbara. It's not really west, but it's kind of west. You know how it is here. The geography is funny because we're right on the elbow of California. But
the beach is on the north.
Exactly. Don't confuse me because I have the layout here really well and it's west and we're just going to leave it at that. I grew up on what's considered the west side of Santa Barbara, and we grew up poor. So parents working full time during the summer. We had a little radius that we were allowed to go when I was in elementary school, and my older brother was like in charge of us. So we couldn't get to the public library, which was all the way downtown, the other side of the freeway. One thing that the Santa Barbara Public Library was doing at the time, and I don't know that they do this anymore, but they had the bookmobile, and the bookmobile would go during the summer, especially, and park in neighborhoods that were not close to the library. And the bookmobile parked right the next block from my house by a bus stop. And so it was the same dude. I remember what he looks like. For the life of me, will not ever remember his name, but I would go and check out books every week because I read. I was always a nerd. I always loved reading, and I would just get books, and sometimes the same books over and over because I would read them over the summer. One time he just started chit-chatting with me, do you like comics? And I said, oh, I like reading the comics that come on Sundays, the Sunday funnies. My grandpa would grab the paper, pull that out, and leave it in the house for me. And Calvin and Hobbes. Calvin and Hobbes is not on either of our top 10, but we'll call that a comic strip and bail us both out because Calvin and Hobbes was so important, I think, to both of our childhoods. And I know Andrew loved it when he was growing up as well. So
that Calvin and Hobbes taught my son to read.
Yeah. I mean, so we're talking about it, and I talked to him about the ones I like reading on Sundays. And the next week he brought for me a comic book and said, why don't you try this? And I fell in love. So somewhere around 6th grade, I fell in love with the idea. And this is it's like my 3rd or 1st or somewhere really high up on my list. And that got me reading more. And then when I turned 12, I started reading Stephen King, and I found what's in my top 5 list. I found a book, graphic novel type, that was based off of some stories he wrote. Then it became a movie. So my comic experience was never superhero bound. I would get my McDonald's paycheck, go walk down the street to Santa Barbara Bank and Trust and cash it because I was 16 and didn't have a bank account yet. I would always stop at the comic book store and I would buy horror genre comic books. I actually just found a shoebox of comics that I had bought around that time in the mid 90s when I was like 16. For me, it was always crime, which I loved. Talk about use of visual imagery in a crime novel where there might be clues in each frame that's going to lead along the story. So things like that and horror genre stuff. I remember once the clerk at the comic book store asking me, how old are you? And I was like, I'm 16. He goes, you might need to be 18 to buy this. And I'm like, bro, I've been buying comics from you for how long now? And he sold it to me, and there was nothing in it that was too bad, but he was just trying to be a good person,
trying to be a good shop owner. For sure.
Comics was never for me superhero related. So I'm very excited to talk about some of these that really shaped some of my reading history in life.
Yeah, that's really cool because for me, I had to think of non-superhero comics, but you started with non-superhero comics. And
that's still the bulk of what I read. Any superhero comics really that I've read either came from, accidental or recommendations from you, or just out of like, I want to know more about this thing. Let me read the origins of Batman? What are the first Batman comics? Let me do some reading about that. But anything superhero related really came mostly from just my friendship with you over the years, and you saying, oh, you should read this Batman series. You would really enjoy this Joker series. You would really enjoy this. Here, I think I have one of your Wonder Woman still that you loaned me when I was still living in Ohio. So
yeah, I noticed when I was going through this list and trying to pull things off the shelf, most of them are gone because I've given them away to different people as recommendations. Like, well, I could tell somebody about this, but if I actually hand it to them, they'll probably read it. So most of these, like, I couldn't find on the shelf. I'm like, oh, I probably gave that to someone. Well, whatever. Speaking of the comic book collection, as the story the story kind of ended with me in college going to the comic book store every week. I got a lot of comics, and not anywhere near how many comics a comic book collector has, but within those, maybe 4 years of college when I was going every week, I have a long box upon long box upon long box of these old comics that I don't really want anymore. So around after I got married, made a conscious effort to kind of stop buying weekly comics and become what they call the dreaded trade waiter, the person who's not coming in every week and giving money to their local store, but waiting for the trade paperback to come out, the collection to come out, and just buying that. But now I've switched to just online services, the subscription-based kind of things, and the things that the library puts out digitally. And so what I do, how my comic book collection exists now and has for the last 10 years, probably, whenever Comixology came out, is when I am reading a comic book and it opens up to the front page or the cover of the book, I take a screenshot on my tablet because that's how I'm reading all of my comics. And I have an album that I keep of all of those screenshots of covers. And so that is now my comic collection. So instead of flipping through a long box to look at my comics or looking at a spreadsheet where I've kept, and there are different services that, you can keep track of your stuff, because I'm all digital now to save space, I have an album, 6,000 covers in there from all the comic books that I've been reading. And what I do with that is everybody has these kind of services, but on the TV, I've got the Apple TV, which the screensaver can be a photo album. So in the game room, the TV is always doing a slideshow of my comic book collection. So this is great because it's not taking up space. And it's great because I'm seeing it more. If it was in a long box, I would only see those covers if I purposefully dug out those heavy things and flipped through it. Instead, it's always this kind of reminder that's on display. It's a really great, call it a hack or whatever, but I've been super happy with it. And I would recommend it if you're a comic book reader and you're reading stuff digitally, start your collection of those covers. It's really cool, I think.
That's a pretty great idea. I've been using Goodreads. So that helps me in the moment just be able to type in the first couple of words or letters of one and it'll come up whether or not I read it. But I like the idea of having all that art because that's really what comics are about. It's about the art, right? And that's a little bit of the history of comic books. We're not going to, like I said, we're not going to really get into, but we know just offhand that they were created as a way to sell more newspapers in the early year printing presses because they couldn't do photos, used as propaganda, political propaganda, used as political commentary, again, to sell more newspapers, to sell more whatever was being sold at the time into an entertainment value. And having those covers and having that artwork is really a great way to celebrate that. The origins of all this is the visual imagery. So I think that's really cool. Rob did a really great job of researching all of his comics and that he has on his list. And he has the names of authors and illustrators. I'm going to apologize to the ones on my list because I did not do that. So you will not be getting a shout out, but the love is there just the same.
The reason why I think it's important to kind of pay attention to that and link, I tried to link okay, this is the title and this is the creator and put that in my mind because as demonstrated on the podcast, I'm terrible with remembering names. But with things like this, I find that when I find a comic creator that I usually like a lot of their stuff. So to bring up the name, somebody listening might be like, oh, I've read such and such person before. I'll probably like that. And they're more likely to check it out.
Here we go. Non-superhero comics. Rob, tell me your number 10.
All right, number 10, I put Lumberjanes by Noelle Stevenson, Grace Ellis, Shannon Waters, and Brooklyn Allen. Oh gosh, there's a whole list. Matra Leal and Aubrey Ais. Lumberjanes is both adorable and cool at the same time. It is about a group of Girl Scouts, pretty much. They don't call them the Girl Scouts. They call them the Lumberjanes out there at their camp in the forest. and they have these cool zany adventures with like magical monsters and stuff that are in the forest. The art is very cute. Well, it's very stylized, right? All of the characters look very different. Some are tall and lanky, some are short and squat, some have different kinds of hairstyles and things. It's very purposefully different. It sets the characters apart so that you can visually tell who they are just at a glance, and it reflects their character. Very different from superhero comics, especially older superhero comics where everybody kind of looks the same, right? It's all white guys with square jaws and they might have different color hair, or it's ladies with little noses and small chins and they might have different color hair. This is very purposefully different. What makes it is the characters. The stories are simple. There's a noise in the woods, or one of the counselors is acting funny, so they go investigate and it turns out to be some kind of like Scooby-Doo adventure. But the characters and how they react, they're modern archetypes of what teenagers are like. They're not like classic, you know. It's not like, oh, this is the shy one and this is the loud one and this is the nerd and this is the fat one. It goes beyond that to make it much more realistic as far as how they react to the problems and the situations they're in, rather than superficial kind of labels or archetypes that you would find in other places. And I think that's what makes it special. It reads like a web comic where when you lay it out on the page, it's like one page kind of begins and ends, almost like you would read on like a webcomic or in a newspaper comic. As far as the flow goes, kind of be ready for that. I know some people are like, oh, this is like a kind of herky-jerky way to tell a story. But for me, it didn't take me out of it. It was more of a notice than something that bothered me. But Lumberjanes it's wholesome entertainment and it's modern archetypes. Anybody can read this comic book, I think, and enjoy it for what it is.
I love Lumberjanes. You actually introduced me to this one. I've since introduced it to other
Do you have my
friends and
copy?
kids.
Because again, it was not on the shelf.
You gave me the first couple. This is years after it was already popular. You gave me like, I call them the graphic novels. I know that's not quite the trade. You gave me like 1, 2, and 3 for Christmas one year. So, and I think like 4 hadn't come out yet. So a little bit later in the game, you gave me a couple of them for Christmas one year. I love it. It's not on my list. It should be on my list, but in our conversation setting up for the episode, we also talked about like comic books featuring females, comic books featuring da-da-da. So I'm like, I'm going to save that one in case we do another episode about that. Otherwise it would be on my list. I think of inclusive. This is an inclusive comic. It's not only female based where all your main characters are girls. They are girls of color. They are, as you mentioned, girls of awkward, average body types and shapes. There's one of the characters that you can infer might be autistic, or I don't remember them quite coming out and saying some sort of disability, but it's one they kind of have to grab and take along and sometimes get her focus back up. And growing up when you're that age, you might have a friend like that without knowing the words to what that means, but they include her in everything. It's very
and they don't
touching.
have to call it out, like you said.
Right.
Like you make these inferences. As someone who in education, I've spent a lot of time around like middle school age kids. This is what like an awkward, dorky friend group is made out of.
They might be considered misfits. They might be considered others, the awkward, the weird ones, but they're together at this camp and doing these things and playing on each other's strengths and the value of friendship. And I mean, there's so many good things about Lumberjanes. That's a great way to start.
What do you got for number 10?
My number 10 is Lock and Key.
That's by Joe Hill.
Joe Hill, thank you. Yes, the spawn of Stephen King. I'm a big fan of. They grew up in the house that created some of the most popular horror. And if you've never read a little bit of Stephen King's autobiography type of stories, some of his most popular 1980s and early 90s books he wrote heavily under constant influence of drugs and alcohol, to the detriment of his family. Some addiction and some darkness that he encountered, and his children now create very relatable and good horror thriller in that genre. I can only imagine what they absorbed while seeing their dad go through these descents of madness in some of the books he wrote at the time they were children. There's a really great, actually short, it's not a comic book, I don't know, a comic short, one-shot type deal of Stephen King talking about as he bases around a desk and how he needed to have this big oak desk in his office that proved that he made it. He's an author, and his descent into alcoholism and madness and writing at this big desk turned into all I need is this little space because I want this couch, this TV, and I want my sons in the room. I want my kids in the room while I'm working and they're watching a sports game and we can sit and have a bowl of popcorn. Like, it's a really cool thing. Long tangent to say, Joe Hill obviously changing his name so he doesn't have the accusation that he can only produce because of his last name. Lock and Key is a great series. It's also one that you introduced me to with your having your nose in the comic world a lot more than I do.
Ear to the ground.
Yeah, I like ear works, nose works, whatever works. You are more informed to these things, and you introduced me to the whole first set of Lock and Key, and the artwork is great. The storyline's great. It's now a show, I think, on Hulu or Netflix that is getting a lot of accolades. Horror genre, thriller genre, lots of magical stuff happening. Pretty scary at times. Really good. Highly recommend it.
I knew you would love it. It's super cool. The premise is they get to be in this house, and the house is full of these doors, and the doors have keys, and each of the keys, when unlocked, does something different, and they go on like a different super scary adventure. My experience with this book is a little bit different. I just kept hearing rave reviews about it and how amazing it is, and jump on this. It's going to be so good. It's going to be a classic. I had a very young child at the time. Andrew was probably like 2 or 3 when I picked up that first thing. I was teaching 6th grade. The story opens with a home invasion of a teacher who gets murdered in front of his family. Right. And I was kind of out at that point. I was like, I don't think this is for me. Put it away.
You certainly aren't a horror genre fan in the first place. So,
but I love that supernatural stuff, and I should get back to it. Maybe my way of going back to it will be to watch the show, because I hear that it is also pretty good. But just so you know what you're getting into, it's pretty scary and great.
It's really great. Number 9, I'll start with mine because I don't have a specific one to answer here. Big fan of the Showtime show Dexter, and a big fan of the books Dexter.
And is this the Jeff Lindsay? Does those look?
Yes, Jeff Lindsay is the author of the books. Michael C. Hall plays the main character in the Showtime show that actually just finished a new season. They did an actual final season. So spoilers ahead if you are a fan of Dexter and have not watched New Blood. The series ended after 8 episodes back in 2008 or so. 2008, 2010. It was a while ago. It did not end well. And it was pretty horrible. Lots of mad, angry people. That whole last season was just a hot mess, and nothing like
Now, that's because the star was married to his in-show sister, and they got a divorce, and then they still had to do like 2 seasons together. And am I remembering that? Is that what happened?
You are correct with that internal drama. But that happened actually, they got divorced season 6, and the show was still going well. It's that Game of Thrones bad writing, the final season. It was really bad, and it ended really bad, where Dexter, everybody dies, he fakes his death. The last scene is him as a lumberjack in the snow, sitting at a table by himself in the dark. I mean, it was bad. So they do this last season, and didn't know that I was going to be able to finish it. It started really badly, but they brought in something really great. If you haven't read the books, there's a character, a young kid who has some of the same early experiences that Dexter has. They call it Born in Blood. And so he's with this little boy that he sees some of those same tendencies that he had. And does he train him to be a serial killer like he is? They do that with his own son in the show, and his son's a teenager and finds him because he faked it. It's all this complication. And spoiler, it ends with Dexter's death. And it was a really phenomenal ending. The books end that way. What I love about the comic books is it's just a lot of these one-shots of other things and other kills that you don't see or hear about in the books or the show, because they are pretty intricately related. They go in different directions after the first season and the first book.
So it's an extended universe, not a continuation they did with the Buffy verse.
Correct. And there was supposed to be a continuation. I don't think it ever actually happened. And that kind of turned it around into this final season on Showtime that just ended. The comic books, like the ones you kind of just put up and shown, they exist like the animated Star Wars that fit in between things, right? Like the Rebels fits in between Star Wars movies. Rogue One fits in between Star Wars movies. Those
Star
comics
Wars
act like
comics itself are doing the exact same thing. Like
Right.
you get an adventure of Luke and Princess Leia after episode 4, but before episode 5 when they're doing rebellious things and having little
and
adventures.
they're really consistent with the tone of Dexter, who he is. You're not supposed to idolize him, even though he's technically killing bad guys. He's doing a good thing for society. He saves lives. You're not supposed to idolize him, and they do a good job keeping the tone of that character. He's still a psychopath, sociopath, serial killer. I really love any of those comics, any of those one shots, any of those short series that are related to the show and the books. How about your number 9, Rob?
All right. So number 9, I am going to mention Saga by Brian K. Vaughan and Fiona Staple. This is another award-winning, very popular series that is about as far from a superhero capes and tights comic as you can get. When it was kind of sold to me, it was like Star Wars meets Romeo and Juliet, maybe for those first couple episodes. But I don't think that's a great comparison. It's more like something else sci-fi, maybe a Blade Runner or something a little bit more apocalyptic meets Shakespeare, and specifically like the really weird Shakespeare stuff that happens out in the forests when people are eating mushrooms and stuff like that, because it is pretty off the wall. It's a juxtaposition of like a gritty realism with fantasy type art, if that kind of makes sense. Like the story is complex and the story is adult, but there are talking cats and there are unicorn people and things like that. The Fiona Staple art is very attractive and very fascinating, but also upsetting when you look at it. Like there are challenging. So I wrote down some examples like torso-less sex workers, animal characters that look like Pokemon. There are people who have like big computer monitors instead of heads having like graphic sex on panels. It's challenging. There's also like cute little babies. It is a challenging read, but it's very sci-fi. It's very fantasy and it's very drama at the same time. If you are an adult reader who is just kind of bored with the tropes and the same old things of superhero comics, but you enjoy reading comics and you're ready for some challenging stories that put the characters in very dramatic situations, sometimes life and death, but not the same kind of like bwahaha mustache twirling villain life and death. And if you're ready to see some just really challenging art, unlike anything you're seeing anywhere else, then Saga is right for you. It's low on my list compared to how much rave it has and how much people, might rate it and all the awards that it's won. I don't think it's for everyone. It's not necessarily a fun read. It might end up being like, we might look years and years and years from now as like something like, oh, it was very important to comics for all of the influence it had with storytelling and the science fiction genre and those kinds of things. I could see in 10, 20 years college courses about this book. So it's an advanced comic. Maybe we'll say. You can go to a college course about Watchmen, right? Or about, Mouse and things like that. And I think this is on that level as far as what it makes you think about, what it's saying about our society in this just absolutely crazy world that it's building, and how it builds that world in the first place is something to study and something to be in awe of.
How long ago was it written?
I could look real quick. I want to say 2000.
Okay, so
it might be more recent than that. It was the 2013 Hugo Award winner. So let's say 2012.
2012. Okay, so we're talking about 10 years ago. So it is not like brand new. It's interesting in the way that it's so different, very highly regarded. I appreciate how you said it was a hard read because of the content. That's really interesting. Yeah,
it's like, well, I didn't know that I ever wanted to see that, but in this world, this is something to think about. Like, but it's making a statement, right? Like good art, it's making a statement.
You have a second one on your number 9 here.
Oh, is that what I did? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
I do too, though. That's not your fault. I do too.
I cheated on 8. Oh my gosh, it's a top 11 list. Okay, well then this is perfect. I will say that this is a second number 9, and it's kind of an add-on because this is a book that I really like. It is called Creature Tech. It's by Doug Tenapple, which we recently found out is a super jerkwad, a very problematic creator as far as his stances on, people different than him living their lives in peace and happiness, which totally sucks. People might know the name. He is also the creator of Earthworm Jim, which was a cartoon and a video game and a comic book in itself. I read Creature Tech years and years ago, maybe 10 years ago. And it was one of the first graphic novels that I picked up at the bookstore that wasn't a comic book or something that I had, not a comic book, a superhero or something that I had really been recommended, and just loved the line art that it is and the cool characters and just what a different kind of story it is. It is about it's about a scientist. He's like a paranormal scientist in an Area 51 type government secret facility, right? Where they study ancient artifacts and alien tech, and there are monsters and creatures and stuff in there. And because it is this secret facility, it's located out in one of those like kind of desert towns in California, where if you're driving down the 5 or whatever, and there's just these like little towns that have small populations or whatever. And part of the community deal with the government of like, oh, you can have your crazy dangerous facility here, but it needs to be staffed by our locals. Like, you need to create jobs. So there is this, very highly regarded like super scientist responsible for all of these magic and crazy supernatural things. And he's just surrounded by all of these maybe high school educated yokels from the town that have to do their jobs and stuff. So of course there's a character development there where he's, angry about that. Oh, I'm surrounded by idiots and these people don't do anything, but they grow on him because they all have their little quirks and their little personalities and they're all very nice. Along with that is just the outlandish cool things that he's doing with this alien tech and these like, this alien monster that turns into like a anthropomorphic pig creature, and there's a praying mantis riding a motorcycle, and it's just, the art is fantastic and super cool. It's a really nice, sweet little story. There's a whole thing where he deals with his relationship with his father. Like, there's a lot of character development. It's a good little story. Again, a problematic creator, it seems like it's even more problematic because that creator is still alive and still being a jerk, which kind of sucks. It's a little easier when they're like, oh, well, they're really old and can't hurt us anymore. But it is on my list because it is a non-superhero book that takes up space in my mind as being like just a really full, fun story with great art.
I did the same thing. I put Atomic Robo, which actually I'm going to put on hold because I see it's on your list a little bit later. And you are more versed in Atomic Robo than I am. I have it on the list because it's really fun and I really liked reading it. And
I love Atomic Robo. I put it in the honorable mentions, which we'll talk about probably next episode when we get to the end. But it could be a number one. I just wasn't sure, like, is Atomic Robo a superhero or is he not a superhero? It's definitely a different kind of way of storytelling. But yeah, don't sleep on Atomic Robo. We'll talk about that some more.
So that leads me to my number 8, now that you bring that up, because would you consider the Scooby Gang superheroes? They're crime fighters, maybe. It's a gray area. They don't
have superpowers. I mean, I guess you can say that being able to eat a 9-foot sandwich in one sitting and still being hungry is kind of a superpower, but it's not a superhero.
Okay, Shaggy is high 99% of the time. I believe that's a superpower.
So he thinks he's a superhero, but no.
My number 8 is Scooby Apocalypse, which
Love it.
Is another, later on my list, I have another series that's from before that gets placed into modern times and done so very well. Scooby Apocalypse is, of course, the Scooby Gang, but they start off actually not knowing each other. They're not the Scooby Gang yet, and I love that aspect of it.
It's a reboot. It's not a continuation of like the 70s cartoon series. This is a new imagining.
Same characters, but grittier, modernized, dealing with an apocalypse of aliens. It reminds me some of the tone of The Walking Dead, but instead of zombies, it's aliens and trying to find other humans that have survived and how can they find safe places to be. And the adventures they go on is fighting these deadly monsters and aliens that are trying to overtake the entire earth. I talk about tone with Dexter. The tone of those characters is still there, but Fred's like ripped. And he's burly. He's not a little doughy dude with wearing an ascot, He's got a bandana instead of an ascot. He's got a bandana instead of an ascot, yep. Velma is... We play a non-D&D RPG called Masks. In that game that we play, I have a character named Jade that I think I really modeled after who Velma is in the Scooby Apocalypse, who's
That's
just
interesting.
tech
I did
nerdy.
not know.
I don't think it was purposeful, but as I scrolled back through it for this episode, I was like, oh, this is a lot like Jade. She's not as much like Jade is a juvenile delinquent and Velma is not. So, and they're adults. I think they're adults and not teenagers in the Scooby Apocalypse. So they talk about drinking and drugs, and it's very modern, definitely not for kids. So
yeah, they're like early 20s millennials is how they're very much portrayed, I think.
It's so good. It is so good. It is so fun to read. Most of these on this list, you actually introduced me to. This is no different. I didn't even know it existed. You got me a couple of them for a birthday or Christmas one year. So
that's why I'm your nerd best friend.
Of course.
Keith
I would have
Giffen.
it no other way.
Keith Giffen is the creator.
Keith Giffen,
on this
yes.
one.
Thank you, Keith. Scooby Apocalypse is so much fun to read.
Absolutely. That's a great choice. What a fun book that is. For number 8, I cheated again because I have 2 and because they're kind of in the same genre. And again, I'm like, does this count? Are these actually superheroes? Or are they just kind of characters in a crazy world? Both of them are, I would say like Dungeons and Dragons-esque or homages on both of these.
Sure.
The first is Rat Queens by Curtis J. Weeb and Rock Upchurch. I say Dungeons and Dragons because it is definitely not high fantasy. It is a fantasy world. It's sword and sorcery, but this is not Lord of the Rings. This is not high elves and dwarves in the mountain and, the fantasy tropes that you're used to. It's more like just this crazy hodgepodge of high fantasy tropes along with modern ideas that you and your crazy friends in college would make up. It's got orcs and it's got goblins and it's got these things, but it also has like drugs and modern style relationships and those kinds of things. This is it's an all-female cast, which is again kind of takes that genre of what you might think from your high fantasy or whatever and flips that on its head. Usually if you read like a straight Dungeons and Dragons comic book or something in that genre that adheres tightly to those tropes, you'll see a group of 5 heroes and they'll be like a token female, right? This is completely female led and they all are just damaged people, right? They're like your friends coming together to sit at the table and play D&D, and they're all bringing their own issues into the fantasy world, right? There's the drug users, there's the alcoholics, there's the sex addicts, there's one of my favorite characters is the cleric, right? Which in D&D tropes is, like the holy person, the healer. The cleric is an atheist who is trying her damnedest to not believe in the eldritch Cthulhu-like god that is granting her powers. Like it's so good. Again, it's a more adult, but just funny and well written and well drawn. It is absolutely a romp. If you have any interest in, I don't even want to say again, like that high fantasy, because it's not serious. It's not Tolkien. It is more like goofy Dungeons and Dragons ripoff. That's what this is. And I think it's a really well done one.
Really appreciate another series with basically badass women, right? Also one that I would have put on this list if I wasn't trying to reserve for female-led comics, just like Lumberjanes. I've appreciated reading this. It was a little bit of a slow read for me, a little bit too hard for me to get into, but I also tried reading it before I had really played more D&D. So you don't need to have the D&D understanding, but to get those parallels and what those characters stand for made it a little more enjoyable for me to go back and restart it. But I appreciate Rat Queens a lot. What's the other one you have for number 8?
So the other cheat, because it's kind of the same as far as the genre of like a goofy fantasy world, is Skullkickers. Skullkickers it's about, a dwarf and a dude, like your like human fighter archetype, but he has guns. He's got pistols instead of swords, where pretty much everybody else has like swords and axes and magic. This dude like blows people's heads off with pistols. They are very mercenary. They're that like murder hobo idea of Dungeons and Dragons, where it's like, what's the plot? Well, we need to get paid to go like kill something. Perfect. And they go on from there, right? So it's short stories. A lot of the issues are self-contained, where it starts with they get a job. The job goes wrong. Hilarity ensues. But the dialogue between the two characters is really good. The violence is just extreme, right? It's bloody and it's cartoonishly violent in any opportunity that it can be. They're always yelling out kind of like the witty, remember in like 90s action movies while they're like blowing, shooting machine guns, they have some like witty one-liners, or they'll stand over the dead body and like say some pun or something like that. It's
heck yeah.
Full of those.
Okay.
Which is done in a pretty clever way. If you don't mind kind of like some cartoon violence, some swearing, and you like that kind of D&D aesthetic or that vibe of high fantasy, this is it's a fun book. It's on there because it's just fun to read and you can read them real quick. Skullkickers.
I like the idea of short stories as comics, right? Same characters, but different things happening as you go along.
Yeah, and you'll pick up the next issue and they're somewhere else and they're doing this,
I like
think
that
there
idea
maybe are a couple two-parters, but you don't have to worry about continuity at all.
Or going out the next Wednesday to get the next episode. Tell me about your number 7, because I think I started reading this because of something you recommended. I didn't finish it. I didn't continue. So I'm really interested.
Okay, so it didn't capture you. My number 7 is Sex Criminals by Matt Fraction and Chip Zdarsky, an amazing writing team. If you have enjoyed the Hawkeye television show, that is based on the Hawkeye run by Matt Fraction, which is equally as good, but that's a superhero comic, so it doesn't come up here. But just absolutely fantastic writing. Again, unlike anything you're going to get in a superhero comic or anything you're going to get anywhere else. This is the story of a girl who discovers that when she has sex, even if she's by herself, time stops, literally. But it's not it's not gratuitous, right? It's not like a sexy cheesecakey like book. What it really is a coming of age story. What it really is a comedy. It is about this girl struggling with this superpower. It is about this girl trying to grow up and go to college and find relationships and struggling against that. Where it gets cool, where the hook comes in is eventually she finds a boyfriend who has the same power, and they're able to connect with each other, and they realize that this is happening. So of course they use it as an opportunity to rob banks and go on a crime spree because they can stop time whenever they're together.
So essentially they have to bone and then break the law.
Exactly.
Oh my gosh.
There's all these situations. And it is definitely a comedy, and it is a laugh out loud funny book. But the situations that they have to get themselves into, sneak into a bank and maybe like go into the restroom and then sneak and find places, and the fear and the pressure to perform in these situations so that they can pull off the heist and think it's really fun. And I don't know if they did this on purpose or if it just kind of ended out this way. There's a lot of barriers to entry, right? Like the book is called Sex Criminals. That's not something you necessarily want to put on your list or do in your Google search. When you hear the premise of like, it's this girl and when she has orgasms, time stop. It's like, okay, well, is it kind of like a cheesy, sexy book or whatever? And it's not. It's none of those things. It is a comedy, and it is a coming of age story, and it deals with young people and having their first sexual relationships and those kinds of things. Like, it is a good read.
You are right. When you first recommended this to me, I'm like, is he giving me like graphic novel? But exactly. It really isn't. It isn't gratuitous, I think is the what
I don't think there's any, I'd have to double check, but I don't remember that there's any nudity in it. It's definitely not full of nudity.
And if it is nudity, it's artistically nude because you know that they're in the act or she's in the act. It's not big breasted girls dangling the parts everywhere, which definitely could have been something like that. So great suggestion. My number 7, another Joe Hill. I'm a fan of the stuff that he's doing. He also co-wrote a book with Stephen King that I haven't read yet. So he's making some good content. In this case is a one-shot. Basketful of Heads is a thriller. Oh, it's amazing. It is so good. It's a thriller, crime, horror. The female lead is the heroine that figures it out all in the end. And it mixes in some of that good old boy, small town, good old boy network where they're getting away with doing bad things. Boss Hogg kind of, not funny though, not comedy. Yeah. Boss Hogg kind of style where the crooked sheriff and the boyfriend are in on some drug deals and
the creepy small town stuff.
Yes. And she becomes aware of it. some people try to come murder them, and they fake an escape from prison, and it's just all kinds of stuff. And she ends up chopping some heads off, and she puts them in this basket, and they're still able to talk to her and communicate with her as she's solving the crime. So it hits all of my boxes. It hits the horror genre. It hits the crime solving. It hits the female lead badass character. I mean, it's a really great story. It's so good. I've read through it now maybe 3 or 4 times. It is a single story. It's not a series. Highly recommended. Basket full of heads.
All right, I'm going to go to my number 6.
Do it.
This is Pulp by Ed Brubaker and Shannon Jacob Phillips. This is I don't know why this story spoke to me so much. It reads almost as a movie or a screenplay, as it is a small slice of life kind of story about this man who is a pulp writer for a newspaper, right? He writes short stories or maybe a magazine, a publication in the early 1900s. And he writes cowboy stories. And it's all about, this cowboy figure and his partner and how they're outlaws and they travel the plains and they go on these heists, and it's always kind of Robin Hood, steal from the rich to give to themselves and, the poor, or pour money into the local economy kind of thing. So they're a little bit heroic and they go on all these adventures, and it's very pulp storytelling of the time. In his real life, as this older gentleman writing these stories, his life is sucky. He is alone. He's old. He is abused by the young, magazine publisher person who is always trying to cut his wages or editing his stories or telling him that the stories are not good enough and those kinds of things. And then that is juxtaposed a third time with flashbacks from his life in the 1800s towards the end of the Old West, where he was a cowboy, and one of these characters is based off of him, but it's not like it is in his stories, right? It's much more muddy, much more shades of gray, much more scary about shooting people and life not being worth much and being out in the middle of nowhere in the West, and how easily it is to just disappear somebody and they've never been heard from again, and just kind of how scary and that his real cowboy life was. You learn about his family in Mexico and how they died of influenza in 1910 and all these kinds of things. It's just a very powerful book. The way it jumps through time, but you see the imagery and the symbolism of the different things that are happening and how they line up is really well written by Ed Brubaker, who I have a lot of fondness for Ed Brubaker's work. I've read a lot of his stuff. It's more modern. I think it only came out a few years ago and won a bunch of awards as well. Great recommendation. If you like Westerns, if you like kind of slice of life stories that are, again, not superhero related at all, very much more real. Not that it's real, it's definitely a work of fiction, but it's not quite as fantastical, I guess I want to say.
No, it's definitely realistic. What I really appreciated about this one, you mentioned the jumping of time. You learned that his pulp writing was based a lot off of really bad things that he encountered or got involved in his youth, in the turn of the century going into the 1900s. And then he finds himself in a predicament to help someone else using those same skills.
Don't spoil it.
No. As he's coming along and basically being told the way he writes and the content he writes isn't applicable anymore. He finds himself in a modern application of it. I really appreciated that one. And I'm curious, how did you find out about it?
I heard about it on a podcast that I was listening to.
A mutual friend of ours had it and said, you would really like this. You should read it. And I actually read it just recently. So,
I believe I gifted it to that friend.
You might have. That's why I asked. Would it have been really funny if she had said, hey, check this out. Gave it to you and said, oh, you should check. Like, it was funny how all that works. I was just trying to find the it's a small world moment.
Well, totally right. And that's how comic books have always been. Like when you were, if you were a kid and you had comic books, you would sit and read comic books and you'd trade with your friends and they'd read yours and you'd read theirs and you'd pass them around. And I mean, that was a Friday night when I was in junior high, right? It was reading comic books. Even in the year 2022, Electric Boogaloo, we were still passing around comic books and letting each other read our stuff.
My number 6, another of your recommendations, another one I had no line that was happening, but very often when I rewatch Buffy, I happen to think, how different would this episode be, this arc be in modern times? So many times Buffy's running in high heels in that funky way she runs. I don't know how she gets places so fast that I think, man, if she just had a cell phone, it's a trap, Giles. Beep, beep. Here's a text message. Buffy, don't go to the castle or whatever. I think about that all the time. And oh my gosh, they did it. A reinvention, a reboot of Buffy as a modern teenager with all the technology and all the use of everything. It expands Willow's use of technology because it was really like,
oh, that's right. Yeah.
Hardly anything. 1997 when the series started.
She was the character who knew what the internet was at that point. Now she's a hacker.
And you had that early episode that's so horrible. It did not age well, where she like gets in a weird relationship online with someone, and you shouldn't do that. The internet's really dangerous. You don't have any of that here because technology is a thing. They've answered a lot of those questions, but they also brought back characters in different ways. In this one, Principal Wood is actually a teenager and a love interest for Buffy. Giles is a bit edgier in this one. He's not as nerdy of a librarian as he is in the show. It's all the same characters, same images, same idea, but placed in modern times. And I really appreciate how they answer those questions for some of very similar arcs. I also appreciate that they go way more into the Hellmouth supernatural way earlier than the series did. So I believe the first couple pieces of this comic series of the new, I call it New Buffy. It's actually just called Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I don't.
That's what I was going to interject. So there are different Buffy the Vampire Slayer comics. There was one series by a different publisher that went on for years and years and years as a continuation of this story from the show. This one we're talking about is from Jordi Belair, Russ Manning, and Dan Mora. When you're looking for it later, and this is the 2019 Boom Studios.
Thank you, because I just went into a tangent about Buffy, which I tend to do a lot. I will say you have to be careful when looking for Buffy comics because you have the Dark Horse series that was seasons 8 and 9 and maybe 10. Then you have what we talked about earlier with the Star Wars or Dexter, where there's all of these different series and pieces and origins and all
omnibus. Yes,
those where it fits in between the series and after the gap between season 2 and season 3 and so there's all kinds of Buffy comics. This one in particular, 2019, is a reboot from the beginning of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, but as a modern teenager dealing with modern issues. They have text messaging, they're text messaging each other, and they still have that teen drama piece to it where there's interest to the characters, but it really answers the question very well. What would this be like? What would Buffy be like if she had the technology that they didn't have in the early 90s, mid 90s, late 90s to fight the origins of evil?
So I will give this as well a wholehearted endorsement. If you are someone who watched Buffy 20, 30 years ago and you kind of have fond memories of it, don't go back and watch the show. As someone who recently did that, I will tell you, instead, go read this comic book. It's everything you love about it. It's modernized. It's good modern storytelling. I think you will absolutely love it.
I can watch this over and over.
You remember. You'll remember. You'll remember. If you've seen it, don't go back. You'll remember.
Read some synopses and you'll be fine. No. I'm
really
happy
for this. The comic will help you remember, like, oh, yeah, Anya, I remember her kind of deal. Or like you said, like Principal Wood or Wood.
I can't ever remember his first name, but Wood is the last name.
Wood, yeah,
it's like a
but
Raven.
Oh, yeah, I remember. He was at the end and his mom and whatever.
We talked in our Buffy one shot about, like inside jokes. They do a really good job just having that continuity. Some of those are there. Amy, the character, is there. References to some things to the show is really nice, but it doesn't pay homage to the show a whole ton other than basic premise of the story and the basic premise of each character. So really great twist to Xander. I'm not going to spoil it because it broke my heart. What happens to him, and it's so good. I will say he doesn't die, so I'll throw that out there. So I say broke my heart, but because it's completely different than the series, it is so good, and they really play on the strength
kind of the same, right? If you think about Xander and what kind of character he was in those early episodes, as far as kind of a loser, kind of a lonely teenage boy, those kinds of things. Like, it's a modern update to that, which I thought was really, really good.
And I think they play on the relationship between Willow and Xander much better than the show. The show made it awkward by having those two kind of hook up, and then it kind of just dissipated from there. And then they tried to replay it again at the end of season 6 with evil Willow and Xander being the one to, but I love you. This is not you. They didn't really lead up to that And in this new comic series, they do a really good job playing on that close friendship that those two have as the books continue. So I really appreciated that as well.
Number 5. My number 5 is Strangers in Paradise by Terry Moore. This is an artist written and drawn book. Terry Moore is just a gift. His art is gorgeous, beautiful, all black and white pen drawings. His storytelling is just right out of very slice of life, but at the same time, of course, like put together in a story structure, almost like a situation comedy or a good movie. Strangers in Paradise it's a love story. It's more like a drama. I wouldn't say a romance necessarily, but there are definitely themes of relationships throughout. I guess if I were to give it a context or give it a comparison, it may be like Friends or like Sex and the City, but I don't like any of those shows, but I really like Strangers in Paradise.
Okay.
It's about Kachu and Francine and their best friends and their roommates, and maybe they're also in love, but they go through they're always kind of there for each other, but they're also always dealing with each other's dramas as, they get different boyfriends and they have different friends that come to the house and they get wrapped up in different situations and dramas that are always dramatic and just so believable, unlike anything that you're seeing in comics, when you're just seeing these beautifully drawn women in these more realistic situations of being around the house with, bad hair and frumpy pajamas and things like that, or when they are drawn to be going through things and just crying and like sloppy crying, bawling, and the art that he's able to do with that is just so above and beyond anything that you're seeing in superhero comics as far as facial expressions and body language on the page. Just absolutely fantastic. Terry Moore does a wonderful job with this book. I think it's another one of those where if you're interested in the art of comic books, if it's something that you want to get into and kind of, study on your own as a hobby, Terry Moore is a must read, and looking at his art is a must. He does post his art on Instagram as well. That's a good follow. But I'm going to tack on to this as well. I would say that Strangers in Paradise is definitely like the flagship Terry Moore. He also did a book called Rachel Rising, which is also his writing and his just beautiful, beautiful art. But this is about a young woman who wakes up on the side of the road and, stumbles back to town, and through different situations realizes that she died in a car accident or was murdered on the side of the road. And now she is this undead person trying to figure out what that means and who killed her and what happened and how is she going to make her way through the world and how is she going to continue to exist, but she's dead. And I think that is a good Annalise recommendation. I think you would very much enjoy Rachel Rising.
I was thinking, why haven't you showed me this one?
Yeah. Now I'm thinking about it like, put that on the list. That might be your birthday present this year, is a good volume of Rachel Rising. But also Strangers in Paradise, absolutely fantastic. Get it at your library and just pour through the volumes and volumes of this work.
Strangers in Paradise sounds a little bit like Laverne and Shirley. Did you ever watch that growing up?
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah, that's what, as you were describing, I'm like, that's like Laverne and Shirley. So
that's a great comparison. Yes.
Nice. Very good. For me, number 5, I alluded to this earlier. This one was I will consider, other than the Sunday comics or the Sunday funnies, the first comic book I had my hands on is The Adventures of Tintin. Originally it's a French writer. Its origins is in French. When I went to France about a decade ago now, I actually found a complete set being sold by a merchant on the street, but of course it's all in French, so it was a really cool old looking book, but I did not, because as much as I'm a fan, I want to be able to actually read it.
Right.
This was what the Bookmobile dude recommended. He brought me a couple of these Adventures of Tintin. If you've never read them, it's about a kid. He's essentially a kid who ends up in crime fighting or crime solving situations with this drunk former sailor captain, who's really more of a child because he's constantly trying to find rum. And then you have kind of a Tweedledee and Tweedledum type police. They're always getting themselves not in trouble, but they
have zany adventures. They get themselves themselves into little problems.
The two policemen, comedic relief, I guess. There are some very serious things that happen. There's murder and guys shot and people coming to Tintin saying, I've heard you've done this, please help me. And he's got his little dog sidekick, and he finds himself trying to solve murders or solve crimes. And in one series, he's looking for the captain's lost ship. His family's ship was lost for years, and they go searching for the treasures, and a lot of high fantasy type stuff. I didn't know it as high fantasy then, but that is the first.
There's like pirates and there's sea monsters and stuff, right?
Sometimes, yeah. And sometimes it's all on land and it's human, and sometimes it's a little bit of both. So series was made into one of those partially animated, partially acted movies.
Very stylized movie.
Yeah, they made it very comic book like.
Pretty good, yeah.
Yeah, it was a good movie. I was super excited when it came out. It reinvigorated my love for those books. I actually went out and bought a few, got them from the library to reread them before the movie came out. So that one was a very influential book for me. It's only number 5 for me as influential and as close as to my heart that it is, because the next ones I have coming up are just even more mind-blowing for me as an adult. But Adventures of Tintin is perfect for kids who love to read. It's just really good. I'm just a big fan.
That's a common story. So many of my friends who are also all nerds in their own way cut their teeth on Tintin in the school library. It's an old book. Like, this was a book that was made, across the world before we were born.
Yeah.
But we've all read Tintin, right?
Yeah.
We all know Tintin.
But before we go, Rob, what's the nerdiest thing you did this week?
Oh my gosh. This is one of those amazing nerd moments where there is this thing that exists created by nerds just like me that I had no idea existed. I am sure it's been around for years and years and years, but it was new to me, and it is an app called Board Game Stats. This is everything I've ever wanted as far as keeping track of my games and my playing of my board games and tabletop games, cranked up to 11. This, you enter the games that you have, right? So if you're someone like me, picking from a list, it's hooked up, it syncs with the Board Game Geek website. I'm just blathering right now because I'm so excited about this. It syncs up with the Board Game Geek website. So as you search for your games, a link will come up that has the box art, and it has the different information of like how many players, what ages, what's the time, like this kind of thing. Or you can enter it yourself. If you have some older games or some lesser known games or whatever that you want to put in there, you can put it in yourself, and you can put all the cool stats like that. So I spent my week, I have entered 79 games from my game room into
my goodness.
It inventories them for you to whatever detail you want. So, if you've got your different cabinets and different shelves, I could put like game room cabinet 1, shelf 2 if I wanted to get that incremental about it. The other thing that's super cool is you can enter players, and you can log your plays. You can log who won, how many points they got, those kinds of things. You can attach pictures of the session, which I always love taking pictures of my miniatures on the table and stuff like that. And you can put them there, and it gives you analytics. It gives you charts. charts and graphs. It gives you rankings of how many games you've played this year. What was your most favorite game? It gives player rankings of how for each game of how often they win and what kind of points they are. Or overall, like, oh, you've played with Analese 36 times this year and she's won 27 times on these 5 games. It is absolutely incredible. It is so nerdy and it is so right up my alley. I got this recommendation from a friend on Instagram and I just poured over it all week. I could not keep my hands and eyes off of this app for the next like 2 or 3 days as I was entering all this stuff. This year is going to be so fun. I'm going to log all of the games we play and stuff on this app at the end of the year, which is how I found it. The people on Instagram were posting their game stats for the year. And I'm like, what? How do you get game stats? I'm going to have charts and graphs and all this kind of stuff to reflect on and just nerd out about board game stats. The app blew my mind. Nerdiest thing I did this week.
Guys, this is peak nerd. I've been getting screenshots of this the whole week. And it's amazing. I agree. I like watching the analytics. And you know what I was thinking about when you were sending me those screenshots is it's too bad that you don't have the like years and years that you did the Curse of Strahd on Halloween. And imagine if you could look back on who played when people like died, when their characters died, like boom, 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 boom. That would have been pretty amazing to have.
It starts now. When's the best time to have bought stock in whatever? 10 years ago. When's the second best time? Right now.
Yeah.
That's where we are with board game stats. We're starting right now this year, 2022 Electric Boogaloo. I'm going to have all the analytics and all the numbers. I'm going to be just impossible to live with.
Your nerd data for 2022. You better add that to your Trello board.
No need. I don't need to be reminded of this. This is the new hotness. How about you?
I am not complaining because when we get returned to Dark Tower, we will get it. Mm-hmm. You backed this in somewhere 2019 around my birthday, and you kind of gave me the little printout for my birthday that year. So we've been waiting, and we'll get to play it when we play it. But the one thing that I'm not a fan of with this Kickstarter and how it played out with the troubles of shipping, and I don't blame them, I get it. They got over the base game to the States, it hit land, and they went and sent out to the people who bought just the game. And it seems a little backwards. I feel like a company would want to honor the people that went all in and gave the most amount of money, but those other pieces aren't here yet. So instead of having the game sit in a warehouse where they can't really do that, they're just shipping them out. I have been watching the gameplays on YouTube that people are doing, the unboxing that people are doing on YouTube, and I just can't stop watching all these people play this game. And I'm really not trying to spoil it for when we get it and we get to unbox all the pieces, but
that's what I'm worried about.
I'm a little jealous. Jealous.
You know, I see those unboxings for stuff a lot because a lot of times with games, they'll ship to different parts of the world first. Mm-hmm. Another game that I'm looking forward to is Conan 2. Australia got it like 2 weeks ago, right? And they're just all over it and stuff. But I avoid the unboxings and I just try to scroll past those posts because I want the experience for myself. I want to see how they packed it. I want to do it. Man, oh man.
I will say, after watching the latest unboxing, someone did it's really artistically done well with like good background music and good angles so you can see all the pieces. Turns on the tower and you can hear the first little beeps, and it's the same 8-bit sounds that the original had, so that got me really excited. I am really glad you talked me into adding on the neoprene board.
Nice. Because
the board it came with looks gorgeous, but no one has a neoprene board yet. I think that's the last piece they're waiting for before they send out to everyone who went all in. I don't even think we went all in. I think there were a couple of pieces we didn't add on. We're pretty close to being all in.
There were things for like card sleeves and just like extra colored dice and things that I didn't think we needed, but
yeah. So we're a few items short of the all in, but the neoprene board, I'm looking forward to seeing how much bigger that makes the game and more detailed. So
it's going to be really nice for like placing things on the board, rolling dice when the skulls fall out instead of like clacking on the cardboard and bouncing off the table and stuff. I think they're going to like thud and roll, and I think that's going to be a nice experience too.
Yeah, get your 3D printer ready, because I have read from some of the people that the skulls are easy to lose. One guy said, I know it came with 36, and this morning when I tried to play it again, I only had 32, but I have cats, so we'll see what happens. So people are already asking if there was a file for 3D printing out yet. Nobody has one yet, but apparently that's a thing.
Cool thing that I also like to do with board games that you want to keep your eye on those forums too is nerds will design box organizers to 3D print, because a lot of times you'll pull everything out of the box and you'll unwrap it, you'll take it off the sprues and everything, and then where do you put it in the box? So you're like, okay, well, now I need a bunch of like little Ziplocs for all my chits and all that kind of stuff, and they're just going to kind of sit in there and move around. But what people will do is they will design in 3D card holders that perfectly fit everything, and little boxes and stuff that keep everything organized separate that also fit perfectly in the cardboard box that it comes with. I've done that for a number of my games, and that's a really fun thing to do as well.
I recall seeing the one, I think for Strahd.
Yeah,
I was like, wow, this was really smart box. And you're like, actually, some nerd made a 3D printout of this, and and it is perfect. It like whoever designed that one did a really good job. I would also like to say for our listeners, Rob is saying chits, CHITS, chits. I just want to make sure we're very clear. We're still a clean content podcast.
Right. Like for those of you who maybe aren't the board game nerds, let's see, you got your chits and you got your meeple and you got your game pieces, your tokens. There's a bunch of lingo that goes into your board games.
So what's the nerdiest thing you're going to do next week?
The nerdiest thing I'm going to do next week is I'm going to continue with something that just started recently at the beginning of this year. Another mutual nerd friend of ours who is into miniature painting set themselves a goal of wanting to paint a miniature a week this year, because we're like, just like me, we're all trying to get through our miniature board games and get them painted and on the table. So this is the first time that I have done a nerd Trello board, like a 22 for 22, but this is a 52 for 22, where we're keeping a board with a small group of us to post our miniature that we paint a week. We decided we can work ahead and we can work behind, but at the end of the year, we're going to have 52 cards on there that have pictures of our painted miniatures posted. So that's really fun as well. And it adds a little bit of outside accountability and should be real fun. So I got to make sure that I'm keeping up with that Trello board.
Well, that'll be cool to see how other people paint their minis as well.
It's very easy to see painted minis on the internet, and they look gorgeous because there are some amazingly talented artists out there. There are people who do it for a living, right? You could be a mini painter commission artist and do it. And those people have very strong online presence because they're a brand and they're selling their talents and all those kinds of things. So that can be maybe a little disheartening to some people like me, because my minis will never look like that. But this is all just the three of us, and we're amateurs just trying to get stuff done. I'm just going to keep going with that. How about you? What are you looking forward to?
Our dog's turning 1.
Okay.
So we're going to have a dog birthday.
Shut up.
We're going to nerd it out and get a little dog cake and put a little dog hat on her and say happy birthday. So we're going to have a little fun with that. I think that's going to be
fun. Hear your sister's voice in my head, just looking at you and saying, you dork.
Yeah, pretty much. I've never had a dog before, so we're going to celebrate this. She made it to 1. We're on a roll. It's just fun. I've owned cats before. I've never done a birthday for a cat that I can remember. I had a partner that would take my cat to like sit with Santa and weird things like that way back when.
Oh, sure. That's a thing. Yep.
Yeah, but no, this will be fun. Just more than anything, just to treat her with something fun that's outside of what she normally eats or the normal treats we have around, just to give her something fun. So that's going to be really fun. That's good. It's nerdy.
Yeah. I suppose it is. If your dog is like my dogs and the second something hits the floor, they come running to gobble it up, then we're going to have to keep real good track of those skulls for Dark Tower. Yeah,
well, so far she isn't. We're trying to train her not to be. She came to us with some pretty good instincts. We adopted her from Mexico, from a shelter in Mexico, and she had some basic skills already. And also temperament of the dog. I think she's got some very smart instincts. She's a bigger dog than we expected, and she's really great with little kids and little dogs. She bows to their level, and she has really good instincts. So far, when she's tried to rush something in the kitchen that we've dropped, we've been able to stop her or get her out of the kitchen while we're cooking, because she was like at her feet all the time. The most doggiest dog thing she's done so far was that we threw out some old food and had the bag tied up in the bin to take out the next day. And we woke up and she doesn't stay by herself in the living room kitchen area very often. She's in there for 5 minutes. I heard a noise. I'm like, what? Is one of the teenagers up? And I go out there and she's got the trash can toppled over and she's digging in it. So,
oh yes, I've cleaned up that mess a few times myself.
She hasn't done that often. We've even had
it's like a Dos
chicken.
Equis commercial.
Yeah,
I'm not
basically.
often left alone in the kitchen, but when I am, I rip the garbage can open and spread it all over the house.
I'm not too concerned about it, but we also do have to be careful. I don't want to deal with making sure she passed them. So
Oh no,
we'll be careful.
No.
All right.
Awesome. What do you have to say about this episode? Do you want to share the nerdiest thing that you did this week? Join our conversation by following us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, all at Nerd Best Friends, or send us a message by writing to the podcast at nerdbestfriends.com. Be sure to listen, subscribe, like, follow, share the podcast, and give us a 5-star rating.
And by the way, nerds, we have a brand new website, nerdbestfriends.com. So check us out, send us those nerdy pictures, share us your 22 for 22, whatever you got going on that's nerdy. And we'll see you in 2 weeks, next episode, for the rest of our comic book extravaganza.
Looking forward to it.
You know, I had something in my head and I have now forgotten it.
Just
Welcome.
do the episode right, Analese.
I'm trying, man. I'm trying to be candid here. Maybe I need a beer.
I interrupt you.